Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And now, here are your hosts, Scott and Jesse from CompassKnox.com.
Hello and welcome back again to Compass Points, the weekly podcast where we talk about Knoxville news, politics, government, education, business, really anything that gets our attention. I'm Jesse Mayshark, co-publisher and co-founder of Compass, which you can find at CompassKnox.com. I am joined, as always, by Scott Barker, also co-publisher and co-founder of Compass. How are you doing, Scott?
Oh, I'm doing just fine. This is Friday when we're taping this. It's a beautiful day outside, and looks like it's going to be a great weekend. Looking forward to it.
Amen. Yeah, it's going to be warm. We're still in August, and make sure you're all staying hydrated out there and everything. But we are still sort of in nice summer weather here, even though all of our various schools and this week universities are back in session. All right, we do have some things to talk about this week. August is often actually sort of a slow political time, but for both the city of Knoxville and the state of Tennessee, August is a little hotter than usual. Did you see what I did right there?
But a bunch.
Yeah. We're going to, let's see, what do we have to talk about this week? Some interesting developments on the Knox County Merit System Board. And if you're thinking that something called the Knox County Merit System Board inherently cannot be interesting, we will try to make it as interesting as possible. A couple of mental health resolutions being discussed by our local legislatures. A follow-up on the Knoxville Utilities Board's response to the storm damage last week. Pretty significant. Knox County is talking about regulating Airbnb and other short-term rentals. That's a new thing for the county to be looking at. And to start us off, Scott, we are in the midst of early voting for the City of Knoxville elections, and we just had a report come out. We're kind of at the midway point here in early voting. We had a report come out about the turnout so far. How's it going?
Well, Wednesday of last week was the actual midpoint of early voting, and it's not very good as far as turnout goes, which kind of continues trend of anemic early voting in city elections. It's not anything new, but it's still,
I would say, anemic voting overall, not
anemic
just early voting
overall. Yeah. One thing is through Wednesday, that's 7 days of early voting. 3,421 people had voted, both in person and absentee. A couple of things really stood out in the data that the Election Commission released. Almost 8 in 10 voters who've cast ballots so far are 55 or older.
Wow.
Now, that's not unusual that older residents vote more often. I mean, that's a maxim of voting in the United States, not just in Knoxville and Knox County, but that's a pretty significant number. Basically, if that number holds through the entire election, that people who are 55 or older will be the ones who select who runs the city. That's just a given. People always talk about getting young people out to vote. Whoever's trying is not doing a very good job of it. I hate to say, only 6.1% of the people who've cast ballots so far are between the ages of 18 and 34. So it's a very, very small number now that could pick up closer to the election, but it probably won't pick up by much. So whatever efforts are being made to reach younger voters for local elections, it's not working very well. So
well, and it's interesting. This is an election cycle where we have a lot of incumbents running, which often those are the cycles where you get less turnout, partly because incumbents are often unopposed in local elections. That's actually not the case this year. We do have contested races for almost all of the seats on the ballot, except for the 5th District City Council seat. So, are you surprised that we're not getting a little bit more interest, given that, I know the mayor's race is on the one hand competitive because there are 3 challengers to incumbent Mayor India Kincannon. On the other hand, none of those 3 challengers are particularly well-known or well-funded. But the at-large city council races are pretty competitive, right? Yeah. So why do you think that having competitive races isn't goosing that turnout a little bit more?
Well, it is. I wouldn't say it's goosing it, but it is a little bit higher than previous elections that are similar in makeup. In 2007, when Bill Haslam ran for re-election, 2015 when Madeline Rogero ran for re-election, turnout is trending to be a little bit higher than both of those, and neither one had particularly strong opposition either. One of the you mentioned the at-large seats. The really only one of the at-large seats in the primary is very competitive because the top in city council races, the top 2 finishers go on to the general election. So seat A between Lynn Fugit and Cameron Brooks is there are 2 candidates. Both of them will go on regardless of the outcome of the primary.
There is technically a third candidate, right?
But
he's not really running.
Yeah, there's technically a third candidate, Darren Worsham. He's not. He's on the ballot, but he's not really running. He will probably get some protest votes, but that's about it. But the thing about it is he's not going to finish in the top 2. So we know who's going on in that one. Then the seat B race between Debbie Helsley and R. Bentley Marlowe. There are only 2 candidates. Both of them are going on. So really the only competitive race in city council race is going to be seat C, where you have incumbent Amelia Parker, Tim Hill, who is a developer and serves on the Planning Commission and the Sports Authority, and Matthew Best, who is the executive director of the Change Center. All 3 all 3 actually seem to be pretty strong candidates. As far as engaging with voters or raising money or this, that, and the other, the things that make candidates viable. So that one's fairly competitive. So, but top 2 finishers will go on. It's still the primary, not the general election. Always better turnout in general election than primary for particular seats. Then we do have a competitive city judge race for the first time in 20 years, but it's not a contest that typically drives turnout anyway. So,
right.
So,
and that one, the judge's race and the mayor's race are the 2 that could be decided in the primary, right? Because if any candidate in either of those races gets more than 50% of the vote in the primary, they win and they don't have to contest in the general election. And so I think that's anybody who's sitting back and thinking, well, I'll just wait for the general election. Like, if you want to vote in the mayor's race and the judge's race and be assured of having a chance to vote in those, you need to vote in the primary. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing is, of course, as I mentioned, haven't had a competitive judges race in 20 years. Really can't make any comparisons there. But for the past 30 years or so, whenever there's been an incumbent mayor running for re-election, they've won in the primary. They haven't even gone on to the general election. They've gotten more than half the vote in the primary. And so in order for the mayor's race to be contested in the general election this year, the combination of the three challengers will have to add up to more than half the vote. So we'll see how that goes. One of the things that this shows is also the election commission put out some historical data, and you look back and the percentage varies, but on average, the early voting at the halfway point, the in-person early voting at the halfway point, not including absentee ballots, equals about 17% of the total turnout in that election. So by now, if this holds, 17% of the people who are going to vote have already voted, in at least as of last Wednesday. Of course, more have voted since then, but we're talking about this report and what the cutoff is on it. If that holds true during the primary, about 16.5% of the eligible voters will vote in the primary. And as you mentioned, if the mayor's race is decided in the primary, that means that only 16.5% of Knoxville's eligible voters will have picked the next mayor.
Right.
I mean, that's just the reality, and it's kind of one of those things that that higher turnout has. Even if the same person wins with a higher turnout, it's still at least more people have had their say. And the one thing too that came out in this, as I said, this had a lot of historic data in it, and it looked, and it put all in one place, which was really nice. Was kind of how the turnout has gone over the years. Now, and we talked about how the mayor's race tends to increase turnout, and of course that's really the case when there is no incumbent mayor, and it is a competitive race that goes beyond the primary to the general election. That happened in 2003, 2011, 2017. In 2003, Bill Haslam, Madeline Rogero ran against one another, and there were two others in the primary. 2011, Rogero, who lost in 2003, ran against Mark Padgett, Ivan Harmon, who both had pretty significant shares of the vote in the primary. Padgett went on to the general and lost to Rogero. There were also two others in that race. 2017, we had Kincannon ran against Eddie Manis and Marshall Stair and three others. It's a big field and three really strong candidates. The turnout has gotten progressively lower over time. In 2003, 29,000, almost 30,000 people voted in the primary. In the primary, and then in 2017, it had dropped to 19,000.
Mm-hmm.
So it's about a third fewer people were voting in 2017 as voted in 2003, and of course the population's getting larger. So that's kind of, if you're a fan of voter turnout, as almost everyone in politics professes to be, that's a disturbing trend, and that's one that we don't know. Of course, to be the how this year's going to turn out, but 4 years from now, when we know for sure there won't be an incumbent running, it looks like turnout could go even lower despite the rising population.
Mm-hmm. Unless there's something that really galvanizes people to vote, and what that is, I mean, those are there are people. Again, this is not just a Knoxville issue; it is a statewide issue. Tennessee, typically, and in the most recent election too, in 2022 midterms, Tennessee had the third or fourth lowest statewide turnout in the country.
Mm-hmm.
Tennesseans just don't vote very much.
Yeah, Tennesseans don't vote, and that's. I will defer to political scientists about why that is, but for some reason, we don't vote, and and sometimes when there are things like scandals happen, things like that, just kind of part of you wants to say, well, we're getting what we deserve because we voted for them
or didn't vote for them.
Didn't vote for them. So.
Yeah. Well, so I would guess that most of the listeners to this podcast tend to be active voters. But I think that people who are active voters can make a difference in this just by talking to people about it. Talk to your friends, coworkers, family, whether there's particular candidates you want to advocate for, or if you just want to say, hey, there's an election going on. Here's the places you can do it. Why don't you go vote?
Yeah, and one thing about low turnout elections is that each vote counts more, essentially.
Yeah. And where's a place where I could maybe show my friend where to learn about some of these candidates for free?
Well, you could do that at CompassKnox.com, because we all of our election coverage is out from behind the paywall. You can go there. You can read candidate profiles. You can look at who's about fundraising. You can look at reports from the forums that have gone on. There's even more if you subscribe, because we have if you subscribe, you also get our daily newsletter. So that's and we have a lot of information in there about the election. In fact, this report on the early voting numbers is in the email that our subscribers get every weekday. So
that's right. And also, of course, you can go to knoxvotes.org, which is the website of the Knox County Election Commission, which has all of your information about who is on the ballot and also where and when you can vote.
Yep.
So
6 locations in Knoxville to early vote. So
I guess I should also mention while we're talking about Compass subscriptions that we are about to raise our subscription rates for the first time in our 5 years of existence. This September is going to be our 5th anniversary. We've been impacted by the same rising costs that everybody else has, and so decided that this was the time to do this. However, if you are a listener and not currently a subscriber, or if you are currently a monthly subscriber, our current rates are going to stay in effect through the end of August, which means $100 for a year. If you sign up before the end of August, you get that $100 for a year rate. Starting September 1st, that is going to go up to $120 a year. So if you've been thinking about it and haven't gotten around to it, now's a good time to do it. All right, let's talk about Airbnbs. And I guess I should really say short-term rentals, because there's a lot of different platforms. There's VRBO. There's various other ways people do this. But, we're talking about the whole phenomenon of people renting out either entire houses or parts of a house or a condo or a basement apartment or whatever for short-term stays, basically people who are staying anywhere from a day to 3 or 4 days someplace. And of course, there's been a big growth of this in the last 10, 15 years. I don't actually remember what year Airbnb started, but locally it only really started to get traction, I'm going to say like 6 or 7 years ago. The City of Knoxville, which was the first place to be impacted by this locally, did pass a set of regulations on short-term rentals about 5 years ago. I was actually involved in putting those together and kind of shepherding that through the political process when I worked for the city. And that is not a perfect system, as lots of people who live in the city will tell you. City Council just had a workshop last fall, kind of hearing some complaints about the process and whether there's sufficient enforcement, I think, was kind of the biggest issue there. But the city does at least have sort of a regulatory regime. You have to get a permit. You have to notify your neighbors. It has to be, or is supposed to be, an owner-occupied property if you're in a residential area. Mm-hmm. And there are you have requirements for, you have to have somebody on call 24 hours a day who can respond to complaints or emergencies and so forth. And the town of Farragut has actually banned them completely. I think you cannot actually legally operate an Airbnb in the town of Farragut. They just said, we don't want this. But in the unincorporated parts of Knox County, outside the city in Farragut, there are basically no rules on this. And the one thing the county did a few years ago, they did pass an ordinance saying that short-term rental operators in the unincorporated areas do have to pay hotel motel tax, which they also have to do in the city. And so they are theoretically at least collecting that hotel motel tax. But other than that, there's just no rules. You can kind of do it anywhere that is zoned for residential use of any kind. You can have a short-term rental. And it hasn't really been much of an issue, although it has been a rising trend. And if you go to Airbnb, which is the biggest of these platforms, and just try to search for a rental in Knoxville and Knox County, you will see there's lots of properties outside city limits, actually, where people are at least offering their properties for short-term rentals. And so maybe not surprisingly, given what we have seen and heard of this issue in other parts of the country and within the city of Knoxville itself, now we are starting to get some complaints about it. And there's a woman, Julie Clark, who I interviewed for a story this past week. She came and spoke to County Commission last month about this. She and her family live out in a rural part of East Knox County, generally very quiet out there. And last month, in early July, they had a huge party happen at a house on their generally quite quiet and kind of windy and hard to get to rural road, where a house that they knew had been bought a few years ago, but they weren't really sure who lived there or what the deal was with it. Suddenly, this one night, about 40 or 50 cars all showed up, and they had this big old beer blast of a party up at this house on a hill, made a ton of noise, alarmed everybody in the neighborhood. They were shooting off fireworks at 3 a.m, this kind of thing. Eventually, they did call the police for noise violations, and eventually the authorities did respond, although I think by that point the party was kind of breaking up. But it really bothered the people who lived there, and what they found out in looking into this was that this house, nobody lives at it. It was purchased by somebody who, as far as they can tell, lived in Nashville and had just been putting it out on Airbnb. And so somebody rented it on Airbnb and then sent the address around to all of their friends and friends and said, big party, come on out. There's a bunch of people in their teens and early 20s. And so she came to County Commission and said, this is a problem. We need to have, in looking into it, what she found was, the county does not have any rules about this, but, the city does. And so she suggested as a first step that the county might want to look at the city regulations and think about adopting something similar to it. And she got a pretty sympathetic hearing from county commissioners. Her own commissioner, Carson Daly, said that he wanted the county to look at this, and he actually has a resolution on the county commission agenda for this month, asking the Knox County planning to work with county officials and kind of look at what options might be for regulating it. But the thing that was most interesting to me about this is I think there was an assumption by a lot of people that maybe this wouldn't be that big a problem outside of the city and outside of the more urbanized areas, because mostly when people use Airbnbs, it's because they're going somewhere. They're going, and in this case, people who are coming here are mostly going to have business of some kind to conduct in the city of Knoxville, at the University of Tennessee, or someplace within the city. And who's going to want to come to Knoxville and rent an Airbnb that's 20 minutes outside of town in some very rural area? But the interesting thing about that is that whole swaths of South and East Knox County, which are some of the most rural parts of the county, are also the parts of the county that are closest to
the Great Smoky Mountains National Park.
Great Smoky Mountains and Sevier County and Sevierville and Pigeon Forge and everything. We do have, in fact, a giant tourist magnet just to our southeast, and that those areas of the county that are quite rural but that are also closest to Sevier County could be very attractive, and some of them are also very nice,
they're nice in those themselves.
Yeah.
One of the things about you can, when you look into what farmers are doing to bring in more income, everybody thinks about the corn mazes and things like that, the wedding venues, which we wrote about recently too. But one of the things is if they have, an extra house or they build one on their farm, and rent it out as as a short-term rental. And that's kind of, I don't know how many in Knox County, but I know some do.
Sure.
Do that. I don't know what the numbers are on that, but and that's pretty nice bucolic setting, and if you want a relaxing time, even if you don't go to Pigeon Forge or the Smokies, it's still pretty nice countryside in East and South Knox County.
Right. So we'll see what comes out of all that. I know when the city talked about this, we had to deal with a lot of pushback from the short-term rental industry, which at the same time was lobbying the state government, and the state legislature subsequently put some real restrictions on how much local governments can control short-term rentals, but they did leave a fair amount of leeway for having various kinds of regulations. And I guess that may be what we're going to get in Knox County. It'll be interesting to see if, anybody shows up to oppose the regulations, because all we've heard so far is people kind of complaining and saying we need something to protect the people who actually live in these places. Mm-hmm. So we'll see what comes of that. Knoxville Utilities Board had a meeting of its Board of Commissioners this past week, and they received a report on the response to the storms that blew through the previous week that caused damage all across KUB's service area. What did they have to say about it?
Yeah, the storms hit on August 7th. High winds, lots of rain, one tornado in West Knox County, and widespread power outages. And so John Williams, who's the Senior Vice President of Engineering Construction for KUB, gave a report to the commissioners, talked about the extent, and it was pretty darn bad as far as the outage goes and the destruction of the utilities equipment and infrastructure, and interruption of its services is the third worst ever at KUB. The only two that were worse were both in 2011, and up to almost 75,000 customers were without power at its peak, which was Monday afternoon. That was August 7th, Monday afternoon. 57,000 people were without power in Knox County. A lot of the damage was focused in West Knox County. They although there was damage all over Knox County, but that was the one where there was the most damage. He gave a report. Williams gave a report on all of the things that they did, because obviously since it's KUB's board, they talked about things like that. 81 broken power poles. There were 66 damaged transformers. That's a lot of equipment, and a lot of expensive equipment too. And most of the damage came from trees. 83% came just from trees coming down, and these were large, mature trees, and in many areas of the county that fell. We talked about West Knox County getting the brunt, but Lakeshore Park inside the city of Knoxville was hit pretty hard too, and has lots of big trees, and they fell down. Wind caused most of it. There's only 1 in 10 got hit by lightning. The rest of them were all caused by wind. And it was interesting. They had a breakdown of where the trees were from, and and this again shows that a lot of these were mature trees. That most came from outside the trim, what's called the trim zone, because where high voltage power lines go through. Of course, they got to keep the trees out. That's the trim zone, so the trees don't interfere with the power lines. But the majority of these trees that fell and damaged lines were outside of that, which means they're pretty tall. So all in all, they talked about the response. They brought in all their contractors, or 7 contractors came in and helped them out. There were 8 utilities who were in other areas of the region who sent crews here. One as far away as High Point, North Carolina, and they came in. There were more than 300 boots on the ground, as they say, or pairs of boots on the ground, doing work, and it ended up costing. They think it's going to end up costing about $3.7 million. That's only that's up with those other storms as being the most expensive, and they actually went through 1 year's worth of response resources as far as the employee hours and the equipment that the parts and equipment that they had to get and using repairs. They went through a whole year's worth in 1 week. It took within 3 days they went from that 57,000 peak without power to about 1,000 people without power. So they did it pretty quickly. And one thing that William said, there were several factors. Of course, they brought in all that extra help. That was a big help. But he said there were other factors too. One was that it hit in the middle of the day, and that was they already had pretty much their full contingent of workers already at work,
right,
so
they didn't have to roust everybody out of bed to come in on overtime or whatever.
Right. So they were already on the job. They just went to the places that needed to be addressed, and that concentration in West Knox County helped too, because they went from one spot to another in a very, very constrained geographic area, and were able to that was actually helpful to them as far as getting more power restored to more people more quickly. So that was a big thing. And the other thing is something that you might take for granted until something like this happens. They had all their equipment and spare parts and everything on hand.
Mm-hmm.
Even though it was a year's worth, they had that on hand. They didn't have to be, and they Williams said they did this in part because there had been all these supply chain disruptions since COVID. So they basically had their inventory up because if they didn't have enough widgets for their transformers, then who knows when the widgets would get here if they had to order them quickly. So, but they had everything in stock. They were able to do it, and I know it's cold comfort to those who were without power for 3 and 4 days. I mean, they're sitting there going, "Well, KUB was, that was pretty slow, but they say that they work pretty fast, given the amount of damage, and of course and I guess so. I mean, one of the things they talked about the big ice storm back in the 90s, and talking about how expensive it was. I mean, it was 8 days without power for a lot of people. So most, like I said, most of the power was back on within 2 days, and there were still some lingering places, and there were more storms that came through afterwards. I mean, that wasn't the only storm of the week.
Right, there were some people who lost power twice during that week.
Yeah. That was really a big misfortune, but all in all, and of course, this is KUB grading themselves. They gave themselves a pretty good grade. So,
so I'm curious about the trim zone, because, of course, the trim zone can be very controversial. When KUB comes through and is doing tree trimming, which is always when there's not a storm going on, a lot of times people object. They say they cut the trees back too much, or they leave them looking ugly. And, it's kind of been an ongoing issue for many years around that. In general, people don't love it when KUB comes through and either prunes or takes down trees. But given what happened with this storm, and I guess the potential for future strong storms, given what's going on with climate change and so forth, was there any discussion of revisiting the trim zone and thinking maybe it needs to be a little bigger?
No, they didn't really talk about that. And I'm not sure that when they were talking about the trim zone, they were actually talking about the trees along streets where that do need to be trimmed like that. One of the things about those is when they prune those back in the ones that are along the roadways and that are regular power lines, and they pulled those back, it's pretty easy for limbs to fall on those, even when they trim them back. It doesn't take a huge storm to knock a limb into these power lines, but it is an effort to do that. They didn't discuss changing policy or changing that. Of course, it could come up, but these storms have happened in the past. These are generally, this was the first hurricane we've had in August.
Tornado.
I'm sorry, tornado we've had in August ever. So that's unusual, and day in and day out, when just regular thunderstorms that hit haven't seemed to be, they don't cause as huge a problem as they used to. Plus, one of the things that they talk about as far as the upgrading their system and going to fiber is that the system will be more resilient and easier to fix and that sort of thing in the future, moving forward. So even when you have outages like that, theoretically, as the grid gets upgraded, it will be that those outages will last a shorter amount of time. Now, this storm was so big, I don't know if that applies, but we're talking about just your regular everyday occurrences that happen.
Well, I guess they need to restock now on all of that equipment that they had saved up, because even if they used a full year's worth of equipment, I don't know that we can be confident that there won't be another storm for the rest of this year.
Yeah, they spent $3.7 million on the response. One thing they also didn't talk about how much they're going to have to spend to replace all their spare parts and equipment.
Right.
So I'm sure that's going to be pretty expensive as well. And there are those supply chain issues, so we don't know how quickly they'll be able to replenish that.
Okay. Some interesting discussion this week about seeking state funding for more mental health services and facilities in Knoxville and Knox County. Of course, we talked the other week about a joint session that City Council and County Commission had at the beginning of August, talking about mental health needs and the various efforts that both of our local governments are making to address them. And County Commissioner Kyle Ward, at the beginning of this past week, came out with a proposal. He had sponsored a resolution last fall that County Commission passed asking the state to basically appropriate funds to build a new inpatient long-term mental health facility in Knox County, which we haven't had locally, a public facility since Lakeshore Mental Health Institute closed in 2012. And that was also a topic that got talked about at that joint session. And so Ward came out and made a proposal, first of all, just reiterating the desire for the state to build a new local facility. But he also proposed a funding source for it, which would be to reallocate the $20 million that Governor Lee put in his budget this year as a commitment to help pay for the proposed pedestrian bridge across the Tennessee River, which we've talked about before, would kind of span from the University of Tennessee campus at Thompson-Boling Arena across to the south waterfront area there. And basically what Ward said is that, and of course one thing that's happened since then is the city had applied for a federal grant for $25 million to also help with that bridge, did not get that federal grant, so the status of that whole project is a little bit up in the air right now, although the city and the University of Tennessee, both said they want to find a way to do it. And Ward is kind of saying that, well, these mental health needs are much more pressing than a pedestrian bridge for college students, and he's requesting the state to reallocate that 20. It's like, you've already got $20 million set aside for Knox County. Why don't you just move that over and help us build and pay for a new mental health facility? So that was his proposal. Then a little later in the week, we got proposed resolutions that are going to go to both City Council and County Commission next week and the week after, also calling for several things, but one of the things it's calling for is state funding for a new inpatient long-term care mental health facility here. But it does not specify anything about where the money should come from, and it does not talk about that pedestrian bridge. And those resolutions are going to be, so I think Vice Mayor Andrew Roberto is bringing it to City Council, and he's got most of the rest of City Council signed on as co-sponsors.
All but one. And the holdout could add during the meeting. It's just as of Thursday evening when they published the agenda and assorted materials, all but one council member were co-sponsors.
And at County Commission, it's being brought by Commissioner Richie Beeler, and Commission Chair Courtney Durrett is also signed on as co-sponsor, and Kyle Ward signed on as a co-sponsor to that resolution as well. And so actually at this month's County Commission meeting, so Commission has their workshop this coming Monday, and then their voting meeting the next Monday on the 28th. There are actually two resolutions on their agenda. One is from Ward and Commissioner Rhonda Lee, making that specific request to move the $20 million from the pedestrian bridge over to this mental health facility. The other one is it's basically the identical resolution that City Council is considering next week, which is asking for the same thing, asking for that facility, but not saying take the money away from the pedestrian bridge. And then also asking for some other things. It's committing the city and county to each chip in $25,000 toward a data collection study looking at emergency mental health calls. And that is aimed at trying to develop an alternative response pilot program. We've talked about that here before. The alternative response model is one where instead of having a police officer go and respond to an emergency call about a mental health crisis, it would be a mental health professional and an EMT, basically a medic. So it would kind of remove law enforcement from that equation for some of those calls. And then a few other issues too, where they're looking for help from the state to expand their current co-responder model, which the city has, where a police officer and a mental health professional respond to some of those calls. So County Commission is going to be talking about both of those. My guess is that there may be more support on Commission for the one that is identical to the City Council resolution, because it doesn't get into the area of saying, oh, and we also want to take money away from this pedestrian bridge, which some people have supported. County Mayor Glenn Jacobs has supported that pedestrian bridge. So we'll kind of see what that discussion is at the County Commission work session. But it seems pretty likely that we're going to end up with resolutions from council and commission, both asking the state to, put, and as we've talked about before, the state says, well, yes, Lakeshore closed, but in fact, we're actually spending more state money locally for mental health services than we were when Lakeshore was there, which is true. But this is asking the state, saying, great, thanks, we appreciate that.
We still need more.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, one thing about the pedestrian bridge funding thing that's, that's kind of interesting. First of all, the city, which is actually really driving this, it's essentially a city project. Well, first of all, the city didn't ask for the funding to be moved, and it's their project. The other thing is that this is essentially Department of Transportation money. And as anyone who has any dealings with government budgets, it's not the is it Department of Mental Health Services? Is that the official name of the department? It's not their money. This is transportation money. So if the $20 million doesn't go to the Knoxville pedestrian bridge, it will go to another transportation policy. Right. Now, you could say, well, they could transfer, but they could, but that's not the way it usually works. So
right, and it would take legislative action.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, they appropriated.
They're
it was
the
part
one,
of the budget.
Yeah.
For that, even Governor Bill Lee could not just unilaterally take $20 million from here and move it over there. He doesn't have that kind of control over the budget.
And the other thing is the city's not giving up. They are going to reapply for the federal grant that they did not get, and they, one of the things about that particular grant is a infrastructure grant that every city and county in the country just about applies for, and so they're just because they didn't get it this year doesn't mean they won't get it next year. Doesn't mean they will either. But they're planning to reapply for that and look for other sources of funding as well. So they don't consider the project dead in the city, and this is earmarked for a city project. I don't think that the city would endorse such a move, but we'll see. The other issue, the other resolution, I think it's got obviously strong support on city council. I think it'll pass. The one thing that it's kind of interesting with the way the co-response model, which is the one with the police officer and the mental health professional, and the alternative response model, which is, as you mentioned, the mental health professional and a medic of some sort. It funds both, or if they got everything they wanted, they want a grant to be able to expand the existing co-response model to a 24/7 operation. They don't have enough teams to actually do 24/7 coverage of the city. They're wanting some state help in that, and then of course the other is then, and Mayor Kincannon's already said, we can pony up $25,000 for this study. They're wanting the county to do it too, which is interesting because of this whole co-response / alternative response to these types of mental health calls. It primarily come from the city.
Right, we haven't heard yet officially from the sheriff's office on all of this. To what degree, the sheriff that does law enforcement outside the city of Knoxville, to what degree the sheriff's office would be interested in say if they wanted to expand the co-responder model, and or to what degree county commission is interested in an alternative response model outside the city. All of that is a little unclear at the moment.
Yeah, but one thing about it is Sheriff Spangler has often made the point that the Knox County Jail is the region's largest mental health facility because they do handle so many. He's been very supportive of other efforts to divert folks from jail who would benefit from mental health services. Most recently, the mental health court that has just been created in Knox County. It's one of those things that one would think that he probably would be supportive of, even though you presume that if there is a study that county would have to fund some from some source, whatever their part of this would be. But I think Spangler would probably say, well, it's whatever you do, it's going to be cheaper than housing people in my jail.
Right.
So I should say my jail, or the Knox County jail.
The jail.
But sheriffs, when you talk to sheriffs, a lot of times they speak of things that way.
Yeah,
I don't want to.
They're pretty possessive.
Yeah, it's their jail. While they're the sheriff, it's my jail. So,
well, and I think one thing is worth mentioning about Ward's proposal. I think that he's not so much trying to kill the pedestrian bridge as to kind of make the moral argument to the state. Look, if you can afford $20 million for a pedestrian bridge that, whatever its merits, is kind of a nice amenity as opposed to an urgent emergency need, then maybe you can also come up with $20 million for something that is an emergency need. And I think that my sense is that he doesn't care too much one way or another whether that money comes from the pedestrian bridge, as long as it comes from somewhere. And I think that's the real, and that's why he's obviously co-sponsoring both of those resolutions to try to bolster that case. Okay. Also just wanted to mention this interesting meeting this week of the Knox County Merit System Board of Directors, previously known as the Knox County Merit System Council. And this is the body that basically serves as a civil service board for the sheriff's office. It's an independent body. It's not under the sheriff. And they hear grievances from sheriff's employees who believe that they have been unjustly demoted or disciplined or fired, and especially if they think it was for political reasons. And this is the whole reason that you have civil service protection in government jobs, is to protect employees from political retribution of various kinds. Knox County does not have civil service broadly for county employees. Only the sheriff's office has a civil service board. In the city of Knoxville, I think something like 90% of the total city workforce is under civil service. But in the county, it's only the sheriff's office that has any kind of civil service protection. And so this has been a pretty contentious board in recent years, and we've written about this. You can find stories on the website about it. But there was a sense that the previous board, when it was the Merit System Council, it was a 3-member council, and there were a lot of allegations that the members of it were very political, were sort of close with some factions in the sheriff's office, or in recent years with the former sheriff, actually, Sheriff J.J. Jones, and were, Sheriff Tom Spangler felt like that board was kind of weighted against him politically. A lot of questions about all of that. And so County Commission last year reconstituted the board as now a board of directors. They expanded it to 7 members. One of the changes that they made was to put in real restrictions on political activity by members of the board. Now, this is a volunteer board. Nobody gets paid to be on it. And the commissioners basically said, if anybody wants to serve on this board, we appreciate your service, but the most important thing about this board is to provide a truly neutral, apolitical place where law enforcement officers and sheriff's employees can feel like they can get a fair hearing. And the allegation was that previously, depending on who the officer was and who they may or may not be aligned with in the sheriff's office, that some of them felt like they couldn't get a fair hearing there. And so they put in these restrictions. So this week, this board, which has now only been in operation as the new 7-member board for less than a year, already had a proposal to come back and say, well, what if we loosen these restrictions a little bit and allow members of the board to be involved in local politics as long as it's not in a sheriff's race. Kind of the idea being that, well, the real concern here is involvement with sheriff's office politics. And so if you want to be involved, if you want to volunteer for a campaign for county mayor, county commission, state legislature, whatever, that's an abrogation of people's First Amendment rights to say that you can't be involved in this, and maybe we ought to allow it. They also talked about removing a requirement that is currently in place that says that if you are a sheriff's office employee and you want to run for office, you have to take an unpaid leave of absence to do that. That's also a requirement that the Knoxville Police Department has for its employees. And it's interesting. You can serve in office and work for the police department or the sheriff's office. Most recently, we had Brad Anders, who was a lieutenant in the Knoxville Police Department and was a county commissioner at the same time. Lee Trammell from the sheriff's office. And Lee Trammell from the sheriff's office, right? Who ran for sheriff. Yeah. And Trammell served on county commission, right, while he worked for the sheriff's office. But to run for that office, you have to take a leave of absence. It's like if you run and win, then you can continue, you can serve in office and also be an employee to the extent that it doesn't conflict. But the idea that you didn't want somebody in uniform, serving in uniform and also campaigning at the same time. But the Merit System Board looked at that this past week and recommended unanimously that they remove that particular prohibition. And so that'll still have to be approved by county commission, that change. But if they do approve it, it will mean that somebody who is a sheriff's office employee can keep their job, keep getting their paycheck, which is the real issue here. Because, if you want to take a leave of absence to run for office, you're probably talking about 6 or 7 months of not making any money from your job. And, kind of a sense that, well, this is unfairly limiting, you might have people in the sheriff's office who want to engage in the political process, and this is making them make a really tough choice to do that. And so they did recommend making that change. That'll go to county commission. We'll see what happens there. But the recommendation that board members themselves be allowed to get involved in politics, County Commissioner Larson J., who was the real kind of architect of these reforms last year, he came to the board meeting this week and, made a very strong plea with them to not make that change. He kind of said that we put this in here for a reason. And, he said, yes, obviously the sheriff's race is where you're going to get the most potential conflict, but he kind of spun out scenarios like you could have a sheriff's employee, especially now that if they do make this change where sheriff's employees can run for office, he said, look, you could have a sheriff's employee who's running for county commission, say, and feels that they have been targeted, maybe because of their political activity, that they've been targeted by the sheriff and been demoted or disciplined or whatever, and they want to file a grievance with the Merit System Board. But if they know that a member of that board is involved with the campaign of, say, the person they're running against, it might shake their faith in the neutrality of that board, which is the whole point of that board. It's to be an independent outside voice. And so, Commissioner Jay said, look, if you want to write it so that people can be involved in national campaigns, like campaign for president or something, maybe something like that would be okay. It would be hard to draw a direct conflict, but he really made a strong argument. And a couple of board members as well also had misgivings about this, about allowing involvement by people on that board in local races, that it could just unnecessarily kind of muddy those waters. Yeah. And the chair of the board, Christopher Manning, kind of made the point, since this board was all just reappointed in the past year after it got reconstituted. And he basically said, look, we all knew this when we nobody's making us serve on this board. If you don't like that restriction, you can resign from the board at any time.
You can resign from the board and run for office, or resign from the board and manage somebody's campaign. You just can't do it while you're still on the board. And it's an unpaid position.
Right.
So it should not be an impediment for people who do want to get involved in the political process. It's just a sacrifice that they would have to make, and not one that hits their pocketbook.
Right. And so what Manning did ultimately was he appointed a subcommittee of some board members, one who was opposed to making that change, one who was in favor of it, and one who kind of had some questions about it, asked them to kind of look at it and come back with some recommendations that, like, maybe they could allow certain kinds of political activity, but not others. We'll see what comes out of that. But the interesting thing to me about it was it just shows how hard it is to keep politics out of these things. Like, County Commission just last year, because of perceptions of political involvement and entanglement on the board, essentially abolished the old council, reconstituted it, put in this very strict prohibition, and here we are not even a year later, and there's a proposal to say, well, does it need to be quite that strict? Now, another change that Commission did make at that time was that any change that the Merit System Board wants to make, they can make recommendations, but County Commission still has to approve it. And so even if they did come back and say, hey, we've decided we want to all get real politically involved, County Commission would still have to weigh in on that. But anyway, it's one of those little, it's a bywater or backwater of our local political system, but it's one that over time has attracted sort of outsized controversy, and I think all of this is about trying to keep that from happening again, basically.
Yeah, well, that's it's one of those things. It's it's kind of a vestige of the old. There was a time where sheriffs were without question, the most powerful political figures in the state of Tennessee.
Yeah.
Other than the governor. And it's kind of that, anything that involved the sheriff's office in any county was probably the biggest political news of that county at that time. So,
and it's why we have a merit system council in the first place. Again, there is no other civil service protection in the county, but the reason that we have this, and the reason there was a state law passed in the 70s allowing the creation of these councils, was exactly because of the amount of political power and the bad things that sheriffs got up to when their employees didn't have any place to go to if they felt like they were being unfairly treated.
Yeah, and I think that anything to do remotely attached to law enforcement has an outsized political gets outsized political attention. I think that's certainly the case with the in the city as well. Anything to do with KPD is gets a lot of attention. So.
Yep. All right. Well, that wraps up our review of the past week. Seth, why don't we take a break? We'll come back and answer this week's reader question. Okay, we are to the question and answer portion of the podcast. Every week, we go onto our subscriber-only Facebook group, the Compass Colloquy, which you can join if you're a Compass subscriber, which you can become by going to CompassKnox.com. Sign up now while our rates are still low. And we ask our readers, is there anything you'd like to hear about on the podcast beyond the obvious headlines of the week? Question we got this week is related to the city elections. A reader noted that we do have a well-known developer running for city council, seat C, Tim Hill. He is also currently the chair of the Knox County Planning Commission. And the question was, if you have a developer serving on a local body, county commission or city council, and of course, both of those bodies, one of the biggest things they do is make land use regulation and also make decisions about individual projects and developments, rezonings, and tax incentives, all of those kinds of things. So if you have a developer sitting on one of those bodies, how do they deal with any potential conflict of interest in something that comes before the body? And Scott, I think the answer to that is that there are very specific conflict of interest rules, but they're also pretty narrow in a way.
Yeah, one thing, people throw around the phrase conflict of interest quite a bit. Well, and when you're dealing with what is actually a true conflict of interest, it is very narrow. Basically, it's if whatever you're voting on would have a direct financial benefit to you. And what that would mean is, for example, if I'm sitting on a board and there's my business, the business I own, is trying to get a tax incentive. Well, that's a direct benefit to me because it's my business, and that would be a conflict of interest. Now, if I am on this board and the city wants to build a park, if I'm on city council, the city wants to build a park next to my property, which I don't know, I guess it increases the value of your property. Let's pretend it does. And that would increase the value of my property. That's not a direct benefit. I mean, I don't directly financially benefit from that. So
nobody's writing you a check.
Nobody's writing me a check. So I would not necessarily recuse myself from voting on that. And this plays out quite a bit. There are, obviously, one group where you see this a lot is Planning Commission. And, of course, they do nothing but land use. Now, most of what they do is make recommendations. But, their recommendations carry quite a bit of weight. And they do, some of their decisions are final. And there are several developers on the Planning Commission. And, because one of the things is that board, which is basically set up not really to make policy, but to apply zoning regulations, it benefits from having people who know what they're talking about. And when you're talking about land use and development, developers know what they're talking about in general. So that all said, and Tim Hill, as you mentioned, is the chair he's the chair of the Planning Commission. So and one thing that happens at Planning Commission is whenever there is a proposal by one of the members of the commission, and they happen from time to time, that commissioner announces it beforehand. They say they're going to recuse themselves. In some cases, they walk out of the room. They don't even stay in for the discussion. I don't. This person was raising the question regarding Hill specifically. I don't recall, and I haven't looked it up, anything in the last couple of years that his firm, Hatcher Hill Properties, has had before the Planning Commission for him to recuse himself. But I'm sure he has. If it's come up, I don't recall it. A lot of times, developers don't have to go to the Planning Commission if they are developing a property that's already zoned appropriately, and things like that. So, they're very, a lot of developers never really come before Planning Commission at all because of that.
And Hill has had tax incentive packages before City Council, which don't go to Planning Commission, right? Because it's something that's awarded directly by City Council, and so those are certainly cases where if he were on council, he would have to recuse himself. Yeah, and it's one of those things that things like this do happen on City Council as well. One of the things that for example, City Council members, county commissioners are, by the time they get elected, they've been most of the time they've been active in the community. They serve on boards of various organizations and nonprofits. Various organizations and nonprofits come to City Council or County Commission for funding, for grant funding, usually for specific things at small amounts and generally and all. And I believe it was Tommy Smith just recently, a board he sat on, their organization had come to the city for money. And, one of the things is they disclosed it before the vote. And that's the big key, is just disclosing these things. But he said, he pointed out that, this is an unpaid position on a board for a nonprofit. I don't benefit from this. I don't get paid. I don't benefit. So I'm disclosing it, but I'm voting anyway. Right.
And that's quite all right.
That's not considered a conflict of interest because, again, he's not getting money from. Yeah,
one of the things that was interesting in my years ago in reporting. I was reporting on Sheriff Tim Hutchison when he was the sheriff, and he was big buddies with the owner of Chestnut Street Garage, and Chestnut Street Garage, and I mean they were personal friends. They had vacation homes in the Smokies. I think you could throw a rock from one porch to the other, kind of deal. They were friends, and there was no secret that they were friends. They were very, 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 very friendly guys. They pals, and Chestnut Street Garage also happened to be the contractor the sheriff's department used to do towing on a no bid contract. Well, I was asking about that, and the law department, the county law department, basically said, "Listen, Tim Hutchison does not benefit from this contract. He does not get any money from the contract. Therefore, it is not a conflict of interest."
Right.
Now, you could argue that it was cronyism, and I think
it might not look good,
and it didn't look good. And in fact, the reporting, because it was a no bid contract, wound up getting the contract bid publicly after that. Chestnut Street Garage still got the contract, and it actually cost the county more. So I can't, it's not like I can say Crusading Reporter saved the county money. No,
right.
Crusading Reporter actually cost the county a little money.
Thanks, God.
Yeah, but it's all done in the open now, and that was the key, that we were looking at, but that just goes to show that true conflicts of interest, what they say are the real violations, are very narrow.
Right. And of course, a city council member would always be free to say, I'm not legally required to recuse myself here, but, I know so-and-so or have some kind of connection to this. And so for the matter of, to avoid the appearance of impropriety, as they say, I'm going to recuse myself. And that happens sometimes too. Yeah. But if you had something like an overall change to the zoning code that might be perceived as generally beneficial to developers, the fact that you yourself are a developer, like that's not enough of a direct benefit for you to have to recuse yourself.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you can look, if you really want to get kind of wild about it, you could say that, if you're a property owner and you're a city council member, any change to the residential zoning code would have an effect on your property. That's it, none of them. You couldn't do anything,
right?
Everybody
has an interest.
Everybody's got an interest in something, but but the one thing is if things are close, you can always. I mean, the option is always to disclose what your relationship is with the issue at hand, and say I'm not going to recuse myself because I don't benefit directly from it.
Right.
And there's always there are other ways to go about it other than recusing yourself.
And I'm sure that Tim Hill, for example, has thought through all of these things in choosing to run for city council, and probably does not perceive that it would be against his own business. I don't think he would run for city council if he thought it was going to hurt his business.
Probably not.
I don't think that he probably perceives this as being too much of an issue for him. Okay, let's look ahead to next week. The first thing that is coming up next week is the special session of the state legislature. Governor Bill Lee has called legislators, including some very reluctant ones, back to Nashville for a special session starting Monday to talk about a range of issues related to public safety and school safety, and not very much related to firearms. There are a couple of things on the agenda that he has laid out, a temporary mental health orders of protection, sort of a very restrictive or very narrow form of what are called red flag laws that is going to be discussed there. And also they're going to be talking about maybe setting some standards for gun storage requirements, although explicitly stated right up front, these will not really be enforceable or carry any penalties whatsoever. Yeah. And everything else they're talking about is not related to firearms. And of course, Democrats in the legislature and a lot of interest groups across the state still building off of, outrage and real anger that came after the Covenant School shooting in Nashville in March. There are still a lot of people pushing for much more stringent gun safety regulation than anything that's going to be discussed at this session. But obviously that's not what's going to be discussed at this session.
No, I mean, one of the things when this happened, when the Covenant School shooting happened, and there were all the protests, and Lee came out to say this. One of the things that, I mean, the Republican supermajority of the vast majority of the supermajority, a supermajority of the supermajority, as it were, they were opposed to doing this at all. I mean, they got out of they ended the session without voting on anything, and they were opposed to this from the get-go. And this, there are 18 different topics they can talk about and you can only talk about the topics that are listed in the proclamation announcing the special session. 18 different topics, and like you said, a lot of them don't really have anything directly to do with firearms or directly to do with violent crime even. But I think that Lee put all of those things in so that Republicans wouldn't just stay home. So yeah, it's very disappointing for Democrats and gun safety advocates, because it doesn't address anything to do with firearm sales, or it doesn't. They can't because of the rules of a special session. They can't talk. They can't discuss restrictions on firearm sales. They can't places where you can carry and not carry firearms. All those things that people who advocate for more restrictions on firearms think are necessary to combat gun violence. Those things can't even be discussed. So, but I think that these other items were kind of put in there to get some Republican support for this. And one of the things that people forget, and I always bring it up in conversation with people, and people get tired of me hearing me say it, but one of the things you can't forget is you kind of wonder why Bill Lee's doing this, especially when he's kind of bucking his own party to do it. And you can never forget this. His wife was friends with one of the people who was with one of the adult women who was killed in the Covenant School shooting. And one can bet that the lobbyist who's had the biggest impact on whether this special session was called or not was the First Lady.
Yeah.
So, Lee is, he's calling this, and it does kind of indicate that, he takes it seriously, but like I said, there's a lot of stuff that's not on the table. So
right, Democrats would say that he's not taking it seriously because he's not allowing them to address the things that they want to address.
That's true.
But anyway, we will be certainly keeping an eye on everything that goes on in Nashville over there next week. Here locally, County Commission, as we mentioned, is having their monthly work session Monday at 5 o'clock in the main assembly room of the City County building. And among the things on that agenda that they'll be talking about are a potential resolution on regulating short-term rentals, as we just talked about, and also these couple of resolutions on seeking state support for mental health services. So we'll see what happens there. And then City Council meets on Tuesday.
Yeah, they're going to be considering the same resolution on mental health services. They're also going to, and I didn't look to see if County Commission is going to be doing this yet or not, but they're going to consider a resolution that would establish the joint office on housing. So
yes, that is on the commission commission agenda as well.
So this week is basically city county cooperation week in local government. So, but yeah, that joint office on housing security is going to be be on there. There's also going to be new funding for Turnout Knox, which is is an organization that does violence interruption efforts in the in the city, particularly in East Knoxville, but other areas as well. They were launched last year. The city gave them $450,000 then. They're giving $450,000 now. They're just now really kind of getting ramped up. These are people who have kind of that what it's kind of street credibility, and they've some of them have been in gangs. Some of these are people who live in communities where violence is prevalent and can hear things before the police hear them. Can try to go talk to people, try to work with them to diffuse situations and things like that. So, but they're trying to do it in a systematic way. The $450,000 they used last year and this year, a lot of part of that goes to pay, but part of it also goes to training, to make sure that they follow best practices in doing this, and it's not just because it can be dangerous work. So anyway, that funding is going to be on the agenda. And then there's also the Sports Authority is meeting earlier in the day on Tuesday. Nothing huge on their agenda. They're going to get updates on the remaining contracts that could go to disadvantaged business enterprises. That's been kind of an issue that for them to get to their targets on that. And then they're going to talk about infrastructure funding or infrastructure projects. Get an update on that, and whatever else that has to do with the new stadium that's being built. Which, if you go by there, you can actually see concrete going up.
Yeah.
So it's coming along.
All right. Well, we will report on all of those things next week and anything else that happens. In the meantime, if you have not voted, now's a good time to do it. If you have voted, now's a good time to talk to your friends, family members, coworkers, anybody else who maybe hasn't, because
I'm glad you said if you have voted, vote again. I'm glad you didn't say that.
If you have voted, vote again. Why not? Early and often. And I want to just say I have voted. I am 53 years old, so I guess I'm in the minority of people under the age of 55 who have voted, just barely below the age of 55.
I'm one of those people who get to tell the majority what to do. I am over 55. I have not voted yet.
You're an election day voter.
I am an election day voter. There's something special about election day. I really
I'm with you, Scott. I like to vote on election day too.
Yeah.
I don't get to vote in the city race because I'm not a city resident, so I haven't voted yet either.
Even though you are a city business owner,
right? But not a city property owner, so I can't get that hardship exemption. I think is what they call it.
I don't know. It's property qualification.
Yeah,
if you're a property owner in the city, you can be qualified to vote even if you don't live in the city. But if you just run a business there, sorry.
Right. I mean, I pay property tax on.
The business pays property tax.
Yeah. But we don't pay it on land property. We pay it on stuff.
Personal. Right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll be back next week and see what those final, because early voting ends next Thursday, correct?
Early voting ends Thursday the 24th. We will be back. The podcast goes out on Sundays. So that'll be just a couple of days before Election Day, which is the 29th.
Yeah.
So we can we should have all the early voting numbers. We can look ahead to Election Day. So it's coming up, as we said earlier. A couple of the races will be, a couple of races could be decided completely by the end of the day on the 29th when. In the primary. So, and we also talked about how every vote counts in a low turnout election. So, if you are eligible, get there.
All right. Our production, as always, is by Lord Seth Barber at Barbarian Productions. Thanks to Will Wright, who wrote our theme music. We'll talk to you next week.
Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And many thanks to William Wright for composing our theme song. Compass Points is a partnership of Barking Shark Media and Barbarian Productions, and recorded by Lord Seth A. Barber at Barbarian Studios, Knoxville, Tennessee.